Okay, so as we're looking at our Constitution and you're reading through the Constitution, one of the things we need to focus on is what structures are put in place in the U.S. Constitution that fixes the problems under the Articles of Confederation. Because remember, the Constitution was not written as the first government, it was written in response to the problems that we had under the Articles of Confederation. So if you want to think back, right, think back to the things that the government couldn't do under the Articles of Confederation and the problems that the government we had under the Articles of Confederation. Right? The lack of the federal government to be able to tax citizens, the lack of the government to be able to raise an army, right? The fact that the states had more power than the U.S. government, that the states were more powerful than the national or federal government. Right? And that creation of disunity because the national government didn't have enough power as the states. And so we're going to look at how the Constitution addresses those problems and attempts to fix them. Right. So when we look at the first problem under the Articles of Confederation, or that we had under the Articles of Confederation, that was the idea that Congress did not have enough power under the Articles of Confederation. Right? They couldn't have the power. We mentioned in the first slide when I was talking there, they didn't have the power to raise an army. They didn't have the power to collect taxes. They didn't have the power to regulate interstate trade, meaning trade between the states. Right? Trade from like Ohio to Pennsylvania was not protected. They didn't have the power to regulate foreign trade, so they couldn't control trade between the United States and France, or they couldn't force states to follow laws. And so all of those situations really created a situation that said that there was just disunity, right? States didn't have the same trade laws. The United States would make a trade agreement with a foreign country, and the state of Pennsylvania wouldn't live up to it. Right? The U.S. government needed money, and they couldn't force the states to pay. They could only ask them, and the states would be like, no, we're good. We don't need to pay. And so this just created this system of disunity into the government, and because of that, there was no consistency on things getting done. People wouldn't trade with us. We couldn't trade with each other, and it created just a system of chaos, essentially. And so we solved that problem, right, with something called enumerated powers. And so the U.S. Constitution gives the U.S. government or the U.S. Congress specific powers that they can use to enforce laws, right? So it's going to list, when you read through the Constitution, it's going to say, Constitution has the power to raise, or Congress has the power to raise taxes. Congress has the power to raise an army. It goes through and it says, these are the things we think need to be done at a national level, and we're going to list them for you. And that's called an enumerated power. The Constitution also gives what we call Congress what we call a little wiggle room. Okay? And these wiggle room comes in sort of two spots, which we're not going to talk a lot about right now, but we'll talk much more about when we talk about Washington's presidency. One is this general welfare clause, and that's a phrase that you remember from the preamble. And it says that Congress has the power to make laws that provide for the well-being of its citizens. So even if it's not specifically listed in the Constitution, if we can say that provides for the well-being of its citizens, then Congress has the power to make laws that provide for well-being. Good examples of this are things like health and safety laws, right? Laws that regulate the production of food, laws that regulate the selling of medicine, right, and prescription medications. There's no law in the Constitution that says Congress has the power to regulate the distribution of medication, but that is something that people need for their well-being, and so Congress has the power to regulate that. The other one is this necessary and proper clause. And the necessary and proper clause basically says that if Congress has the power to make, if one of the enumerated powers is given in the Constitution, you have the power to do anything that leads up to that enumerated power. So if Congress has the power to regulate an army or to establish an army, then it doesn't say Congress has the power to make housing for the army, but if you have an army, you need housing for the army. And so it would be necessary and proper to create military bases in order to effectively have an army. Right? But this enumerated power lists what are those things that they needed to be able to do under the Constitution right, that they couldn't do under the Articles of Confederation. And they basically go through and say, these are the things we think are most important to be done by the national government. Now, the second problem that we had under the Articles of Confederation was this idea that the states had more power than the national government. Right? And so when the states had more power than the national government sometimes tried to make laws, but they couldn't get anyone to follow them. And that created real economic problems, specifically with trade, but it also created conflict between states because the states didn't all follow the same rules, and that created disunity again. So we solved that problem with something called federalism. And I talked a little bit about federalism when we talked about the Constitutional Convention, right? Madison said that it's not that the people have the power to the states and the states give the power to the national government. It's that the people give power to both the national government and the federal government at the same time. And so what federalism does is it splits the power. It divides power between the federal and national government. So some powers are specifically given to the federal government. Those things that need to be the same for all the states. The power to declare war, the power to make treaties. These things are specifically given to the federal government, and they're called delegated powers. And then some powers are specifically kept for the states. All right? So the first ones are delegated powers to the federal government. And then the second one is some powers are specifically given to the states, right? And that's things like regulate education, issue licenses. These are things that each state could do separately. And those powers that just the states have, that the federal government can't interfere with, are called reserve powers. And some things then need to be done by both the national and the state governments. And so those things are called concurrent government powers. So the powers that both the national and state governments have are called concurrent, right? So those are done by both the state of Ohio and the federal U.S. government, right? Things that can be different for every state, like driver's licenses, right? My driver's license in Ohio, if I move to California, I have to get a new driver's license. Those are kept for the states and called reserve powers. And some powers that have to be the same for every state and need to be unified on a national level are called delegated powers. And that's how we should split up powers under federalism. The second way we solve the problem of states having more power than the U.S. government is something called the Supremacy Clause. And what the Supremacy Clause says is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So if the state of Ohio makes a law and the United States government makes a law, and these two laws conflict with each other, the U.S. government wins. Right? So what the Supremacy Clause says is that, yeah, states can make laws on their own, but at the end of the day, if the Congress makes a law, states cannot make a law that is ignored, that conflicts with a national law, and they can't ignore laws made by Congress. So we can't say, hey, right, the speed limit is 75 miles an hour on national highways, right? Arizona can't be like, yeah, but our roads are pretty flat, so we're going to make our speed limit 95 miles an hour. Nope. U.S. law says it's 75 miles an hour. Now, can West Virginia say, yeah, but our roads are really hilly, we're going to make ours 55? Yeah, because that doesn't conflict with the speed limit, right? If the speed limit is 75, 55 is below 75, so you're okay there, right? 95 is above 75, so you're not okay there, right? So in that situation, Arizona doesn't have the power to make that law. They would have to follow U.S. law. And then we have our third problem under the Articles of Confederation, right? And that was that we are still always afraid that the national government is going to have too much power. They have a little PTSD from their experiences under the British, right? They felt that the British had violated their rights in multiple ways, multiple times. And so they're always trying to make sure that the U.S. government does not create a situation in which they can abuse power again. And so we have two things that set up there. Right? One is this idea of separation of powers, and you've been learning about this for years, right? And what separation of powers says is that certain branches have certain jobs. that each branch has different jobs, and therefore no one branch will have too much power, right? That they will keep the power separated. And so the legislative branch can't just go to war with someone. The president can't just go to war with France without the approval of the legislative branch. The powers are divided. They need each other to do things. And then the last one is this idea of checks and balances. And checks and balances basically says that each branch has the ability to check or limit the power of the other two, right? That if they think that one of the branches is abusing their power, they can check that power. They can correct that power, right? Now, and so that way, no one branch would be able to take over the other two branches. So at this point, and then we have our third solution. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. The Constitution creates a limited government, and that is best exemplified in those first three words of the Constitution in the preamble we talked about on Tuesday. We, the people. The government is not have power other than what the people tell it to do in the Constitution. The Constitution is a list of powers the government has. If it's not listed in that Constitution, then the government does not have those powers. We have limited the power of the government. Okay, now we're done. Okay, there are two things that you're going to want to go back and do on the slideshow separate from what the questions on the Ed Puzzle that I just put on here. And that is on this slide here. Sorry. On this slide. On this slide, there is a link, and you'll have to do this in Google Classroom to watch that video and answer the question. And then you'll want to go to the vocabulary check and drag and drop your vocabulary in the appropriate spots here. Okay? So when you answer all these questions, you're going to go back to the slideshow that's posted in Google Classroom and do the question, watch the video posted on slide 9, and then do the vocabulary that is posted on slide 11. All right?